This is the story of Morgan Freeman's darkest night. August 4th, 2008, the horrific crash in Mississippi didn't just change Freeman's life, it completely destroyed his understanding of who he was. At 71 years old, one of Hollywood's most powerful figures came face to face with the terror of losing everything in a single moment: crushed metal, shattered glass, and the silence that followed. After this night, Freeman would never be the same. His physical wounds healed, but the wounds in his soul never closed. It was supposed to be a peaceful Sunday evening drive through the familiar backroads of Mississippi. Freeman had been visiting his ranch near Charleston, the place where he found solace away from the glittering chaos of Hollywood. At 71, he had reached the pinnacle of his career. An Academy Award winner, narrator of documentaries that shaped American culture, a voice that commanded instant respect and recognition worldwide. But on this particular evening, driving his 1997 Nissan Maxima along Highway 32, Freeman was simply a man enjoying the quiet beauty of the rural South where he had chosen to make his home after decades of success. The accident happened at 11:45 p.m., when most of the world was asleep and the Mississippi highways were nearly empty. Freeman was driving alone, returning from a friend's house after what had been a pleasant evening of conversation and reminiscing about old times. The road was familiar to him. He had driven this route hundreds of times over the years, navigating the gentle curves and rolling hills with the confidence of someone who knew every twist and turn by heart. But familiarity can be dangerous, and on this night, a moment of inattention or perhaps simple fatigue would change everything forever. Investigators would later determine that Freeman's car had drifted off the highway and begun flipping violently, rolling multiple times before coming to rest in a ditch alongside the road. The Nissan was completely destroyed, its roof crushed inward, windows shattered, metal twisted beyond recognition. For anyone discovering the wreckage in the darkness, it would have seemed impossible that anyone inside could have survived such devastating destruction. The silence that followed the crash was broken only by the hissing of steam from the destroyed engine and the sound of Freeman's labored breathing as he lay trapped inside the mangled vehicle, conscious but unable to move, suddenly confronted with his own mortality in the most direct and terrifying way possible. Freeman would later describe those first moments after the crash as a kind of awakening, not just from the immediate shock of the accident, but from decades of taking his physical capabilities and independence for granted. Trapped inside the wreckage, unable to feel his legs, tasting blood in his mouth and feeling the warm wetness of injuries he couldn't yet assess, Freeman experienced a terror that went far beyond physical pain. This was the fear of losing not just his life, but his identity as a man who had always been in control of his circumstances and his destiny. The help that eventually arrived seemed to take hours, though it was probably only minutes before other drivers discovered the wreckage and called for emergency assistance. Freeman remained conscious throughout the rescue operation, feeling the paramedics cutting through twisted metal to extract him from what remained of his car, hearing their urgent conversations about his condition and the severity of his injuries. The ride to the hospital became a blur of sirens, medical equipment, and the growing realization that his life had been fundamentally altered in ways he was only beginning to understand and might never fully accept. The extent of Freeman's injuries became clear only after hours of medical examination and testing at the Regional Medical Center in Memphis, where he had been airlifted from the crash site. His left arm was severely damaged, with nerve injuries that would require immediate surgery and months of rehabilitation with no guarantee of full recovery. Several ribs were broken, his shoulder was dislocated, and he had sustained a serious head injury that left him dizzy and disoriented for weeks following the accident. But beyond the catalog of physical damage, Freeman was confronting something far more devastating: the sudden and complete loss of the physical confidence that had defined his entire adult life. For 7 decades, Freeman had moved through the world with the quiet assurance of a man whose body obeyed his will without question. Now, lying in a hospital bed, unable to grip objects with his left hand or lift his arm above his shoulder, he was forced to confront a new reality where his physical limitations would define his daily experience in ways he had never imagined. The psychological impact of this loss proved more challenging than the physical pain, creating a depression and anxiety that Freeman struggled to acknowledge even to himself. The immediate aftermath of the accident was managed by a team of publicists, agents, and studio executives who worked to minimize the potential impact on Freeman's career and public image. Official statements spoke of minor injuries and expected full recovery, while privately, those closest to Freeman understood that the man they had known before the accident might never fully return. The damage to his left hand was particularly devastating, because it affected not just his ability to perform everyday tasks, but his confidence in his physical presence on screen. For an actor whose career had been built on projecting authority, wisdom, and unshakable calm, the visible signs of weakness and limitation represented a fundamental challenge to his professional identity and self-concept. Freeman's recovery process became a daily confrontation with his own mortality and the gradual acceptance of physical limitations he had never previously considered. Simple tasks that had required no conscious thought, buttoning a shirt, holding a coffee cup, signing autographs for fans, now demanded careful planning and adaptation. The nerve damage in his left arm created not just weakness, but also chronic pain that served as a constant reminder of that night in Mississippi when his life had changed forever. Physical therapy sessions became exercises in frustration, as Freeman, accustomed to mastering any challenge through determination and practice, discovered that some forms of damage simply cannot be overcome through willpower alone. The psychological adjustment proved even more difficult than the physical rehabilitation, as Freeman struggled to reconcile his self-image as a strong, independent man with the reality of his new limitations and dependencies. Friends and colleagues who visited during his recovery were shocked not just by his physical appearance, but by a fundamental change in his personality and outlook. The easy confidence and gentle humor that had defined Freeman's public persona were replaced by periods of withdrawal and depression that concerned everyone who cared about him. The man who had spent decades playing characters who faced adversity with quiet dignity was now struggling to apply those same qualities to his own life and recovery process. The accident had stripped away the protective layer of professional success and public admiration, leaving Freeman to confront his own vulnerability and mortality without the comfort of the roles and personas that had shielded him from such difficult truths throughout his career. The impact on Freeman's career became evident during his first attempts to return to work several months after the accident. Directors and producers who had worked with him for decades noticed subtle but significant changes in his physical presence and emotional availability. The confidence that had made him such a compelling screen presence was diminished, replaced by a cautiousness and self-consciousness that affected his performance in ways that were difficult to articulate but impossible to ignore. Freeman himself was acutely aware of these changes, leading to a crisis of professional identity that compounded his personal struggles with recovery and adjustment to his new physical limitations. The chronic pain in his damaged left arm required ongoing medical treatment and pain management strategies that further complicated his ability to work consistently and maintain the demanding schedule that had characterized his career for decades. Freeman had to develop new techniques for concealing his limitations on screen, using careful positioning, strategic costume choices, and modified gestures to hide the extent of his physical damage from audiences who expected to see the same commanding presence they had always associated with his performances. The effort required to maintain this professional facade while dealing with chronic pain and reduced mobility took an enormous psychological toll, creating a gap between his public image and private reality that became increasingly difficult to sustain over time. Film sets that had once been environments of creative collaboration and professional satisfaction became sources of anxiety and self-doubt, as Freeman worried constantly about whether his limitations would be noticed by cast, crew, or ultimately by audiences whose expectations he felt obligated to meet despite his changed circumstances. The accident also affected Freeman's relationship with the physical demands of his craft, making him acutely conscious of stunts, action sequences, and even simple movements that he had previously performed without thought or concern. Insurance companies and production studios began treating him as a higher-risk performer, adding layers of medical supervision and safety protocols that served as constant reminders of his changed status within the industry. These professional adjustments, while necessary for his safety, also reinforced his sense of being diminished and limited in ways that went far beyond the specific physical damage caused by the accident. Freeman's famous voice work, which had become such a significant part of his career and public identity, was also affected by the psychological impact of the accident. The calm authority and emotional warmth that had made his narration so distinctive were subtly altered by his ongoing struggles with pain, depression, and anxiety about his physical limitations. Recording sessions that had once been effortless exercises in professional craftsmanship became challenging endeavors that required multiple takes and careful management of his energy and emotional state. The meditation and preparation techniques that Freeman had developed over decades of professional work were no longer sufficient to overcome the intrusion of chronic pain and psychological distress into his creative process. Directors and sound engineers who had worked with Freeman for years began to notice the difference, though few were willing to address the issue directly out of respect for his legendary status and concern for his emotional well-being during the recovery process. The gradual recognition that his voice work, like his on-screen performances, had been fundamentally altered by the accident represented another layer of loss and adjustment in Freeman's ongoing struggle to reconstruct his professional identity around his new physical and emotional realities. The social isolation that followed Freeman's accident represented perhaps the most painful aspect of his recovery process, as he withdrew from many of the relationships and activities that had previously brought meaning and joy to his life outside of work. Friends who had known Freeman for decades found themselves dealing with a man who was fundamentally changed not just physically, but emotionally, someone who seemed to have lost the easy sociability and generous spirit that had made him such beloved company in both professional and personal settings. Freeman's reluctance to appear in public situations where his limitations might be visible led to a gradual but significant reduction in his social activities, creating a cycle of isolation that reinforced his depression and made the adjustment process even more difficult than it might have been with better support and social engagement. The man who had once been a gracious host, an enthusiastic participant in Hollywood social events, began declining invitations and avoiding situations where he might feel exposed or vulnerable because of his physical limitations. Family relationships also suffered as Freeman struggled to adjust to needing assistance with tasks he had always performed independently, creating tensions and awkwardness that were difficult for everyone involved to navigate successfully. His pride and lifelong habits of self-reliance made it nearly impossible for him to ask for help, even when such assistance would have made his daily life significantly easier and less frustrating. The result was a stubborn insistence on independence that often led to increased pain, exhaustion, and emotional distress that could have been avoided with better acceptance of his changed circumstances and greater willingness to rely on others during the recovery process. Freeman's relationship with his Mississippi ranch, which had been a source of peace and restoration throughout his career, became complicated by the accident that had occurred on the familiar roads he had once navigated with complete confidence and comfort. The place that had represented escape from the pressures of Hollywood now carried associations with trauma and vulnerability that made it difficult for him to find the same solace and restoration he had previously experienced there during breaks from his demanding professional schedule. Even simple activities like walking around his property or driving to nearby towns became sources of anxiety and painful reminders of what he had lost in the accident, creating a sense of displacement and homelessness that extended far beyond the physical damage to his body. The accident had transformed his sanctuary into a reminder of his mortality and limitations, robbing him of one of the most important sources of emotional stability and personal renewal in his life. Freeman's attempts to maintain his normal routines and activities often resulted in frustration and additional pain, as they discovered that many of the simple pleasures he had taken for granted, playing golf, working on mechanical projects, even reading comfortably for extended periods, now required modifications and accommodations that served as constant reminders of what had been lost. The cumulative effect of these daily confrontations with his limitations created a pervasive sense of grief that went beyond the immediate trauma of the accident to encompass a broader mourning for the person he had been before that night in Mississippi. Changed everything. The process of learning to live with chronic pain while maintaining his professional commitments and public image required Freeman to develop new coping strategies and sources of meaning that could coexist with his physical limitations and emotional struggles. This adaptation process was made more difficult by his reluctance to discuss his challenges openly, leaving him to work through these adjustments largely in isolation and without the kind of support that might have made the transition less traumatic and more successful. The gradual acceptance that came in the years following Freeman's accident represented not just personal growth, but a fundamental shift in how he understood success, achievement, and the meaning of his life's work. The man who had spent decades pursuing professional excellence and public recognition was forced to find new sources of satisfaction and purpose that could accommodate his physical limitations while still providing the sense of accomplishment and contribution that had always motivated his career choices and personal decisions. This process of redefinition was neither quick nor easy, involving years of therapy, medical treatment, and careful reconstruction of daily routines around his new capabilities and restrictions. Freeman's public appearances during this period became exercises in controlled vulnerability, as he learned to present himself with dignity while acknowledging the changes that were obvious to anyone who had known him before the accident. The walking cane, that became a permanent part of his public image, served as both a practical necessity and a symbol of his willingness to adapt to his circumstances rather than retreat entirely from public life and professional engagement. His interviews and speeches during this period often carried a new depth of emotion and philosophical reflection that audiences found deeply moving, even as they represented Freeman's ongoing struggle to make sense of his experience and find meaning in his suffering and recovery process. The accident had stripped away many of the superficial aspects of his public persona, revealing a more authentic and vulnerable individual whose wisdom had been earned through genuine hardship rather than simply accumulated through professional success and media training. Freeman's later work showed clear influences from his accident experience, with performances that carried a weight of lived experience and emotional authenticity that had been present but less pronounced in his earlier career. The roles he chose often dealt with themes of mortality, recovery, and the process of finding meaning in the face of physical limitation and personal loss, suggesting that his art had become a vehicle for processing and sharing his own journey of adjustment and acceptance. His voice work during this period carried a new quality of hard-earned wisdom and gentle acceptance that resonated with audiences in ways that his previous narration, skilled as it was, had not quite achieved. The accident had given Freeman access to emotional territories that his earlier professional success had not required him to explore, enriching his artistic capabilities even as it limited his physical ones. The mentorship role that Freeman had often played with younger actors took on new dimensions as he became someone who could speak authentically about overcoming adversity and finding purpose in the face of serious limitations and unexpected life changes. His willingness to continue working despite his challenges became an inspiration to others facing their own struggles with injury, illness, and the aging process that inevitably affects everyone who lives long enough to confront their own mortality and physical decline. Today, more than 15 years after the accident, Freeman continues to work and create, though at a pace and with accommodations that reflect his realistic assessment of his capabilities and limitations. His legacy from this period includes not just his continued professional output, but also his example of how to face serious adversity with grace, dignity, and continued commitment to meaningful work and relationships. The accident that could have ended his career instead became a source of deeper authenticity and emotional connection with audiences who recognize in his later performances the voice of someone who has genuinely confronted life's most difficult challenges and found ways to continue creating meaning and beauty despite significant personal losses. Freeman's journey from the wreckage of that Mississippi highway to continued artistic relevance and personal fulfillment represents one of the most inspiring examples of resilience and adaptation in modern entertainment history, proving that even devastating setbacks can become sources of renewed purpose and authentic artistic expression.